October 9th, 1944. The military transport USS Lakeland Victory pitched gently in the grey waters off Guam, its hull vibrating with the rhythm of diesel engines. Deep in the converted cargo hold, 18 Japanese women sat in silent rows on wooden benches, their hands trembling as they clutched small canvas bags to their chests. These were not the possessions they had carried into battle. These were items American soldiers had returned to them just hours before, items they never expected to see again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among those 18 women, 23-year-old Corporal Yuki Tanaka pressed her fingers against the rough fabric of her bag, feeling the hard rectangular shape inside. A photograph. Her family. Her parents standing in their garden in Yokohama, her younger brother grinning in his school uniform. The image was creased and faded from being carried through the jungles of Saipan, but it was hers. And the Americans, those same Americans she had been told were demons who delighted in cruelty, had given it back. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell of the United States Navy Women's Reserve descended the narrow metal stairs into the hold, her clipboard pressed against her chest. She had overseen the processing of these prisoners at Forward Operating Base Able on Guam, recording their names, checking their health, cataloguing their possessions. What she had witnessed during that process had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Not violence or resistance, but something far more disturbing. Pure, absolute terror. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The women had expected execution. Every single one of them had been prepared to die rather than surrender, following the strict code of Bushido that governed their service in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Women's Auxiliary Corps. Yet here they sat, alive and unharmed, clutching personal items they believed would have been destroyed or stolen by their captors. Mitchell had served in military intelligence long enough to recognize genuine shock when she saw it. When her staff sergeant had placed each woman's possessions before them during processing, several had recoiled as though the items were weapons. One woman had burst into tears. Another had refused to touch her belongings for nearly 20 minutes, convinced it was a trick, a cruel psychological game before the inevitable torture began. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The photograph in Yuki Tanaka's bag represented more than a family portrait. It symbolized the complete collapse of everything she had been taught about American forces. For months, Japanese military propaganda had filled her training sessions with images and stories of American savagery. Prisoners, she had learned, were stripped of dignity, starved, beaten, and ultimately executed. Personal possessions were looted as war trophies. Women prisoners faced even worse, though the specifics were only whispered about in hushed tones after lights out in the barracks. Now, as the USS Lakeland Victory carried them toward an uncertain future at a prisoner-of-war facility in California, Yuki and her fellow prisoners wrestled with a reality that contradicted every assumption they had held about their enemy. The journey to this moment had begun 3 weeks earlier, during the brutal American assault on Saipan. The women of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Women's Auxiliary Corps had served as radio operators, code analysts, and intelligence specialists, working in fortified bunkers deep beneath the island's volcanic soil. When American Marines breached the outer defenses on June 15, 1944, Japanese commanders issued explicit orders: die with honor, destroy all documents, under no circumstances surrender. Yuki had prepared herself for death that day. She had watched senior officers distribute hand grenades to civilian families hiding in the caves, knowing what those grenades were intended for. She had heard the screams from the northern cliffs as hundreds of Japanese civilians chose to jump rather than face capture by American forces. The propaganda films shown during her training had been explicit. Americans raped, murdered, and mutilated. Better a quick death than capture. But something had gone wrong with the plan for honorable death. Yuki's unit, trapped in a collapsed bunker after a direct hit from American naval artillery, had been buried alive for 6 days without food or water. When American combat engineers finally breached the rubble, Yuki and 17 of her companions were too weak to resist, too dehydrated to swallow the cyanide capsules they carried in small brass cylinders around their necks. The moment of capture remained burned into Yuki's memory with painful clarity. American Marines, their faces blackened with combat grime, had lifted her from the rubble with surprising gentleness. One soldier, a young man with red hair and freckles, had pressed his own canteen to her cracked lips. Another had wrapped her torn uniform with clean bandages. Nobody had struck her. Nobody had screamed threats or insults. The Americans had simply gathered the 18 women, provided first aid, and transported them to a field hospital behind the front lines. At the field hospital, military doctors examined each woman for injuries. Yuki had watched in confusion as American nurses tended to her dehydration with intravenous fluids, cleaned her wounds, and provided fresh clothing. This gentle treatment confused her far more than brutality would have. Japanese propaganda had prepared her for torture. It had not prepared her for compassion. 3 days after her capture, Yuki underwent her first formal interrogation. A Japanese-American intelligence officer named Captain James Yamashita, a Nisei from Los Angeles, conducted the session through an interpreter. Captain Yamashita had begun by explaining, in perfect Tokyo dialect, the protections afforded to prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, signed in Geneva on July 27, 1929, established clear rules for the treatment of captured military personnel. Article 6 of that convention stated explicitly that personal effects and articles of personal use, except arms, military equipment, and military papers, shall remain in the possession of prisoners of war. This included identification documents, insignia of rank, decorations, and objects of value. The United States, as a signatory to the Geneva Convention, was bound by law to respect those provisions. Yuki, however, had never heard of the Geneva Convention. Her training had included no discussion of international law or prisoner rights. She had been taught only that capture meant death, either at the hands of Americans or by her own hand to preserve honor. When Captain Yamashita informed Yuki that her personal possessions would be returned to her, she had assumed he was lying. Japanese intelligence briefings had emphasized that Americans were fundamentally untrustworthy, that they made promises only to break them for psychological advantage. Yet, 24 hours later, a Navy corpsman had placed a small canvas bag before her, containing everything she had carried when captured: the photograph of her family, a small jade pendant her grandmother had given her, 3 letters from her brother, written before he shipped out to fight in China, a worn copy of the Lotus Sutra she had carried for luck. Yuki had stared at those items for a long time, unable to process what she was seeing. In Japanese military culture, personal possessions of captured personnel became enemy property. Her own commanders would have confiscated such items immediately. The fact that Americans not only preserved her belongings but carefully catalogued and returned them challenged fundamental assumptions about her enemy's nature. The other 17 women in her unit experienced similar confusion. Petty Officer 2nd Class Midori Kawasaki, a radio operator from Osaka, had carried a small leather-bound journal containing pressed cherry blossoms from her family's garden. She had expected Americans to destroy the journal, burn it as enemy propaganda material. Instead, intelligence officers had carefully examined it, determined it contained no military information, and returned it to her with an apology for the delay. Seaman First Class Akiko Sato, the youngest of the group at 19 years old, possessed only one valuable item: a small silver hairpin that had belonged to her mother, who died when Akiko was 12. Japanese soldiers who processed new recruits had tried to confiscate the hairpin as contraband, arguing that it could be used as a weapon. Akiko had fought to keep it, risking punishment to preserve her mother's memory. When American military police returned the hairpin during prisoner processing, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, Akiko had collapsed in sobs. These experiences, multiplied across 18 women from different backgrounds and regions of Japan, created a profound psychological crisis. They had been raised on propaganda depicting Americans as savage, uncivilized beasts. The reality of their treatment contradicted those teachings so completely that several women questioned their own perceptions of reality. The Lakeland Victory continued its steady progress across the Pacific, carrying its cargo of confused and frightened women toward the American mainland. Lieutenant Mitchell visited the holding area twice daily, bringing clean water and monitoring the prisoners' physical and mental condition. She filed daily reports to naval intelligence, detailing the women's behavior, their conversations, their evident surprise at their treatment. On the third day at sea, Mitchell witnessed a conversation that would later appear in classified psychological assessment reports. Yuki Tanaka and Midori Kawasaki, sitting together on adjacent benches, discussed their situation in whispered Japanese. Mitchell's Nisei interpreter, specialist Thomas Fujimoto, translated their words in real time. "They want us to believe they are merciful," Midori said, her voice barely audible over the ship's engine noise. "But this is a trick. When we reach America, the truth will reveal itself." Yuki clutched her canvas bag tighter. "Then why return these to us? What psychological advantage does this give them?" "Perhaps they want us to lower our guard," Midori suggested. "Perhaps they want us to trust them before they show their true nature." "But why?" Yuki pressed. "We are captured. We are helpless. They need no tricks to control us." The conversation revealed the depth of their cognitive dissonance. Even with evidence contradicting their beliefs, the women struggled to accept that American treatment might be genuinely humane. Years of propaganda and cultural indoctrination could not be undone in a few days of gentle handling. The psychological impact extended beyond confusion about American behavior. The women also wrestled with profound shame about their own survival. Bushido philosophy, which had governed samurai conduct for centuries and was institutionalized in the 1941 Code of Battlefield Conduct, issued to all Japanese soldiers, and required warriors to fight to the death rather than submit to capture. The code had been reinforced by intense propaganda campaigns celebrating those who chose death over surrender. For these women, survival meant dishonor. Their families would bear the shame of their capture. Japanese military authorities would not inform relatives that they had been taken prisoner. The government maintained the fiction that no Japanese soldier ever surrendered, that all who did not return had died honorably in battle. The women's families would receive notification of death, not capture. If they somehow survived and returned to Japan after the war, they would carry the stigma of surrender for the rest of their lives. This shame manifested in different ways among the 18 prisoners. Some withdrew into silence, speaking only when directly questioned. Others became overly compliant, hoping perhaps that perfect obedience might somehow erase the stain of capture. A few expressed anger at their own weakness, at their failure to find a way to die with honor. Dr. Margaret Foster, a Navy psychiatrist who would later evaluate the prisoners, noted in her reports that this combination of cultural shame and cognitive dissonance created unique psychological challenges. The women were simultaneously grateful for their humane treatment and ashamed that they needed such treatment. They were confused by American kindness and guilty about their confusion. The Lakeland Victory crossed the international date line on October 14, 1944. Lieutenant Mitchell marked the occasion by distributing additional rations to the prisoners, including fresh fruit and small portions of rice prepared by the ship's Japanese-American cook. Several women initially refused the food, suspecting poison. Only after watching Mitchell and her staff eat from the same pot did they cautiously accept the meal. That evening, as sunset painted the Pacific sky in shades of orange and purple, Yuki removed her family photograph from its canvas bag for the first time since boarding the ship. She studied her parents' faces in the fading light, wondering if they had received notification of her death yet, wondering if her younger brother was still alive or if he too had fallen somewhere in China or the Pacific Islands. The photograph, taken 3 years earlier in the spring of 1941, showed her family in happier times. Her father, a school teacher, stood proud in his best suit. Her mother, elegant in traditional kimono, smiled softly at the camera. Her brother, barely 15 then, grinned with the unself-conscious joy of youth. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated from her current reality by more than physical distance. Yuki turned the photograph over. On the back, in her mother's precise handwriting, were written the characters for family, honor, and remember. Remember who you are. Remember your duty. Remember your family's honor. But what did honor mean now? She had failed to die with her unit. She had allowed herself to be captured alive. She carried her family's photograph in a bag returned to her by enemy soldiers who should have destroyed it. Everything she understood about duty, honor, and shame had been turned inside out by the simple act of American soldiers respecting her personal possessions. The next morning brought clear skies and calm seas. Lieutenant Mitchell assembled the prisoners on deck for fresh air and exercise, maintaining careful security while allowing them brief respite from the confines of the hold. The women stood in small groups, speaking in quiet voices, watching American sailors go about their duties. What struck Yuki most forcefully during these brief periods on deck was the normalcy of it all. American sailors laughed and joked with each other. They shared cigarettes and photographs from home. They complained about the food and the heat, just as Japanese sailors would have done. These were not the inhuman demons of propaganda films. They were simply men far from home, doing their duty in a war none of them had chosen. One young sailor, perhaps 20 years old, noticed Yuki watching the crew. He approached cautiously, aware that prisoners might be frightened or hostile. In halting, badly accented Japanese, he said, "Good morning." Then, realizing he had exhausted his vocabulary, he smiled apologetically and pulled a photograph from his wallet. His family, a mother, father, and 2 younger sisters, standing in front of a white house with a picket fence. Yuki, surprised by the gesture, retrieved her own photograph and showed it to him. For a moment, 2 people from nations at war simply stood together on a ship's deck, sharing pictures of the families they missed. The sailor nodded appreciatively at Yuki's photograph, mimed respect by bowing slightly in the Japanese fashion, and returned to his duties. This small interaction, this brief moment of shared humanity, affected Yuki more deeply than any interrogation or propaganda lecture could have. The sailor had not mocked her, he had not taken her photograph or damaged it, he had simply recognized a fellow human being far from home. In that recognition lay the seeds of a profound transformation that would continue throughout her captivity. As the USS Lakeland Victory approached the California coast on October 23, 1944, 18 Japanese women stood at the rails, watching the shoreline emerge from morning fog. They had survived capture, survived the belief that they would be executed, survived the confusion of gentle treatment. Now they faced an even greater challenge. They were about to enter the heart of enemy territory, carrying with them personal possessions that represented not just memories, but evidence that everything they had been taught about their enemies might be fundamentally wrong. The photographs, letters, and small treasures they clutched represented more than sentimental value. They represented the beginning of a psychological journey that would challenge their understanding of war, honor, and humanity itself. The ship's engines throttled back as it approached San Francisco Bay. Yuki pressed her canvas bag against her chest, feeling the photograph inside. Whatever awaited them in America, she would face it carrying proof that at least one assumption from her training had been wrong. The Americans were not mindless savages who destroyed everything they touched. They were, in some deeply troubling way, capable of mercy. That mercy would prove far more difficult to process than cruelty would have been. Cruelty, they understood. Mercy demanded they reconsider everything. The USS Lakeland Victory docked at the port of San Francisco on the afternoon of October 23, 1944. Military police formed a secure corridor from the ship to waiting transport vehicles, their rifles held at ready but not pointed at the prisoners. Yuki and her 17 companions descended the gangway slowly, their legs unsteady after weeks at sea, their eyes wide with disbelief at what they witnessed. San Francisco Bay bustled with activity on a scale that defied comprehension. Dozens of Liberty ships lined the docks, their holds being loaded with supplies for the PacificTheater. Massive cargo cranes swung pallets of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and equipment onto vessels that would carry them to forward bases across the ocean. Welders worked around the clock on new ship construction, their torches casting brilliant sparks against the grey afternoon sky. Petty Officer Kawasaki grabbed Yuki's arm, her fingers digging in with painful intensity. "This cannot be real," she whispered in Japanese. "Our intelligence reports said American industry was crippled by the war effort. This is impossible." But it was not impossible. It was simply the truth that Japanese military intelligence had either failed to grasp or deliberately concealed from their personnel. The United States possessed industrial capacity that exceeded Japan's by orders of magnitude. A single American port handled more shipping tonnage in a week than some Japanese ports processed in a month. The women were loaded into military trucks for transport to their detention facility. As the convoy moved through San Francisco's streets, they witnessed scenes that further challenged their understanding of American society. Women in coveralls worked alongside men in the shipyards. African-American soldiers directed traffic at busy intersections. Chinese shop owners conducted business openly on street corners. The diversity and apparent equality shocked women who had been taught that American society was rigidly segregated and on the verge of social collapse. Their destination was the Presidio of San Francisco, a military installation that housed a detention facility specifically prepared for Japanese prisoners of war. The facility, originally designed for German and Italian POWs, had been modified to accommodate the unique security and cultural requirements of Japanese personnel. Colonel Robert Harrison, the facility's commanding officer, had received explicit instructions from the War Department regarding treatment of these unusual prisoners. Unlike most Japanese POWs, who were immediately transferred to camps in Australia or New Zealand, these 18 women possessed potentially valuable intelligence about Japanese naval communications and code systems. They were to be treated strictly according to Geneva Convention protocols, with additional considerations for their gender and the psychological value they represented for propaganda purposes. The detention compound consisted of a series of wooden barracks surrounded by double-layered chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. Guard towers occupied each corner, manned by military police who had received specialized training in handling enemy personnel. The facility was designed to be secure but not brutal, to confine without dehumanizing. As the prisoners entered the main processing building, they carried their canvas bags containing their personal possessions. This simple fact that they still possessed these items after weeks of captivity continued to unsettle them. Yuki kept one hand on her bag throughout the processing procedure, as if fearing someone would finally take it from her. The processing procedure itself proved to be another lesson in the gap between propaganda and reality. Each woman was photographed for identification purposes, fingerprinted, and given a thorough medical examination. Navy corpsmen checked for malnutrition, disease, and injuries requiring treatment. Several women showed signs of dehydration and vitamin deficiency from their ordeal on Saipan. All received immediate medical care. First Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, one of the few female personnel assigned to the facility, served as the primary liaison between the prisoners and camp administration. Gonzalez, whose parents had emigrated from Mexico, spoke fluent Spanish and basic Japanese learned from Nisei soldiers at previous postings. Her presence helped ease some of the prisoners' anxieties about being surrounded by male guards and interrogators. "They keep asking about their families," Sergeant Gonzalez noted in her daily reports to Colonel Harrison. "They want to know if we'll notify their parents that they're alive." When I explained that we would notify the Japanese government through neutral channels, several became distraught. They said it would be better if their families believed them dead rather than know they surrendered. This desire for their families to remain ignorant of their survival revealed the depth of shame these women carried. In Japanese military culture, a soldier's honor was inextricably linked to their family's honor. Capture brought disgrace not just to the individual but to parents, siblings, and extended family. Better to be remembered as honorably dead than dishonorably alive. The barracks assigned to the prisoners were clean but Spartan. Each woman received an individual cot with clean blankets, a footlocker for personal items, and access to shared bathroom facilities. Compared to their accommodations during military service, these quarters were actually quite comfortable. Compared to what they expected from enemy prison camps, they were luxurious. On their first evening at the Presidio, after settling into their barracks, The women gathered in small groups to discuss their situation. Yuki sat with Kawasaki and two others, speaking in hushed tones despite the absence of any guards inside the barracks. "This is a new form of torture," suggested Seaman Akiko Sato, still clutching her mother's silver hairpin. "They make us comfortable, so we lower our defenses. Then they will strike." "But when?" Kawasaki challenged. "We have been captive for 3 weeks. If they intended to torture us, why wait? Why provide medical care and return our possessions?" "The Americans are clever," another woman offered. "This is psychological warfare. They want to break our spirits without violence." Yuki said nothing, simply removing her family photograph from its bag and studying it in the dim light of the barracks. Her silence spoke volumes. She was beginning to suspect that American treatment was not a psychological trick, but simply the application of rules and principles her own military education had never mentioned. The next morning began a routine that would structure their days for months to come. Reveille at 600 hours, followed by roll call, breakfast, and assigned duties within the compound. The women were put to work in the facility's laundry and kitchen, tasks that kept them occupied while providing opportunities for intelligence officers to observe their behavior and build rapport. Major Patricia Williams, the facility's chief intelligence officer, conducted initial formal interrogations during the first week. Williams, a former professor of East Asian Studies at Stanford University, possessed deep knowledge of Japanese language and culture. She approached interrogation not as confrontation but as conversation, building trust gradually through patience and cultural sensitivity. Subject, Tanaka expressed surprise when shown photographs of American aircraft production facilities, Major Williams reported to her superiors. When presented with statistics indicating monthly production of over 1,500 aircraft, she initially claimed the figures must be propaganda. Only after I showed her multiple independent sources did she begin to acknowledge the possibility that her intelligence briefings had been incomplete. These interrogation sessions provided the prisoners with their first formal education about the Geneva Convention and international law regarding treatment of POWs. Major Williams explained Article 6 in detail, using an interpreter to ensure complete understanding. Personal effects and objects of personal use, except arms and military equipment, could not be taken from prisoners. Money could only be confiscated with proper receipt, identification documents, insignia of rank, decorations, and objects of value were specifically protected. Your government signed the Geneva Convention in 1929 but never ratified it, Williams explained during one session. However, the Japanese government agreed in 1942 to abide by its terms. The United States, as a full signatory to the convention, is legally bound to follow these rules. That is why we returned your personal possessions. It is not kindness, it is law. This explanation, delivered in matter-of-fact tones, troubled Yuki more than dramatic declarations of American benevolence would have. Laws governing treatment of prisoners implied a system of international cooperation and mutual obligation that contradicted everything she understood about warfare. War, she had been taught, was about total victory achieved through superior fighting spirit. The idea that nations could agree on rules limiting warfare's brutality seemed almost absurd, yet here was evidence that such rules existed and that Americans followed them. Her photograph, her jade pendant, her brother's letters, all had been catalogued, protected, and returned according to international law. This was not mercy, this was procedure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological transformation that began with the return of personal possessions deepened as the women witnessed daily life at the Presidio facility. They observed American military police changing shifts with casual efficiency. They watched supply trucks deliver food and medical supplies without apparent shortage. They noticed female military personnel working in administrative roles with the same authority as male officers. One incident particularly affected Yuki's understanding of American military culture. During her second week at the facility, she witnessed an American private being disciplined by his commanding officer for speaking disrespectfully to Sergeant Gonzalez. The officer's rebuke was sharp and public, making clear that gender did not diminish authority within the American military hierarchy. This stood in stark contrast to Japanese military culture, where women served in auxiliary roles with limited authority and faced significant barriers to advancement. The idea that an American male officer would defend a female sergeant's authority against a male subordinate challenged Yuki's assumptions about American weakness and lack of discipline. The prisoner's daily routine included English language instruction, another Geneva Convention requirement. Article 18 of the Convention specified that prisoners should be given opportunities to learn the language of their detaining power. 2 hours each afternoon were devoted to basic English lessons taught by Nisei instructors who could explain concepts in Japanese when necessary. These language lessons provided more than vocabulary, they offered insight into American cultural values. When learning words for rights and freedoms, the Nisei instructors explained concepts like individual liberty and civilian oversight of military power. These ideas, foreign to Japanese political culture, initially seemed chaotic and undisciplined. How could a nation maintain order if individuals possessed rights independent of collective obligation? Yet somehow America maintained not only order but overwhelming military and industrial power. This paradox troubled Yuki deeply. Japanese propaganda had insisted that American individualism and materialism made the nation weak and fragmented. The evidence before her suggested the opposite. American individualism seemed to coexist with extraordinary organizational capacity and industrial efficiency. Food at the detention facility proved to be another source of psychological disruption. The prisoners received regular meals of reasonable quality and quantity, prepared according to dietary guidelines established by military nutritionists. While not luxurious, the food exceeded what many Japanese civilians were receiving under wartime rationing. Several prisoners experienced guilt about eating adequately while their families potentially went hungry. This guilt manifested in various ways. Some women ate sparingly, as if punishing themselves for survival. Others ate everything provided, driven by instinctive need to maintain strength. All struggled with the moral implications of being better fed as prisoners than they had been as active military personnel. Corporal Tanaka raised this concern during a group discussion in the barracks on their 3rd week at the facility. "We eat white rice while our families subsist on mixed grains and vegetables. We sleep on clean beds while they endure bombing raids. How can we face them when the war ends?" "If the war ends," Kawasaki corrected grimly, "if Japan prevails, we will be executed as traitors for surrendering. If America prevails." She did not finish the thought. None of them could imagine what an American victory would mean for their homeland. The arrival of mail from Japan, facilitated through neutral Swiss intermediaries, provided both comfort and anguish. The International Committee of the Red Cross maintained communication channels between prisoners and their families, though messages were heavily censored by both governments. In December 1944, Yuki received her first letter from home since her capture. The letter, dated September 1st, had been written before her family knew of her fate. Her mother wrote cheerfully about garden vegetables and neighborhood news. Her father added brief notes about his students, and her brother included a single sentence, "I hope to make you proud." The letter said nothing about whether her brother was still in school or had been conscripted into military service. It said nothing about whether their house still stood or had been destroyed in bombing raids. Yuki held that letter for hours, reading it repeatedly until she had memorized every character. Her family's words, written in innocent ignorance of her capture and survival, represented a world that no longer existed. The gulf between that world and her current reality seemed unbridgeable. She carefully placed the letter in her footlocker alongside her photograph, her jade pendant, and her brother's earlier letters. These items, these small pieces of paper and metal, constituted her entire connection to a life that felt increasingly distant and unreal. That the Americans allowed her to keep them remained the most disturbing aspect of her captivity. By January 1945, the prisoners had developed a routine that resembled normalcy. They worked their assigned duties, attended English classes, received regular medical care, and maintained the barracks according to military standards. They had not been tortured, starved, or executed. They remained alive and relatively healthy 5 months after capture. This extended period of humane treatment forced even the most skeptical prisoners to acknowledge that American behavior was consistent and intentional. This was not an elaborate psychological trick. This was simply how Americans treated prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention was not propaganda, it was actual law that actual people followed. The psychological impact of this realization varied among the 18 women. Some, like Yuki, began cautiously accepting that they had been systematically misinformed about American character and capabilities. Others, unable to reconcile their training with their experience, retreated into silence and depression. A few maintained defiant insistence that the truth would eventually reveal itself, that American kindness was merely delayed cruelty. Major Williams documented these varying responses in detailed psychological assessments that would later inform American understanding of Japanese military culture and propaganda effects. These women are experiencing what can only be described as fundamental worldview restructuring, she wrote in a February report. They were indoctrinated to believe Americans were subhuman savages. When confronted with evidence of American humanity and organizational sophistication, their entire framework for understanding the world collapsed. Some are rebuilding new frameworks based on observed reality. Others are suffering severe psychological distress from the inability to reconcile propaganda with experience. The return of personal possessions, which might seem like a minor detail in the broader context of prisoner treatment, actually represented a crucial turning point in this psychological restructuring. Every time Yuki looked at her family photograph, she was reminded that Americans had honored international law by returning it. Every time Kawasaki opened her journal of pressed cherry blossoms, she confronted evidence that Americans valued cultural heritage. Every time Akiko touched her mother's hairpin, she acknowledged that Americans recognized sentimental attachment. These small items served as constant, tangible proof that Japanese propaganda had been wrong about fundamental aspects of American character. If the propaganda was wrong about this, what else might it have been wrong about? This question, once asked, opened doors that could never be closed. In March 1945, news reached the facility about the devastating firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th. The raid, which killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, represented the escalation of American strategic bombing campaigns against Japanese cities. Several prisoners had family members living in Tokyo's working-class districts, areas that suffered the heaviest damage. The psychological toll of this news was immediate and severe. Women who had maintained emotional stability through months of captivity broke down completely upon learning that their families might have perished in the flames. Medical staff intervened to prevent several attempts at self-harm. The facility's chapel remained open 24 hours a day, allowing prisoners a place for private grief and prayer. Yuki's family lived in Yokohama, not Tokyo, but she knew the firebombing of the capital was merely the beginning. American strategic doctrine called for systematic destruction of Japanese urban industrial capacity. Yokohama, with its shipyards and factories, would inevitably face similar attacks. Her family photograph might already represent people who no longer existed. This realization created a terrible moral paradox. The same Americans who had treated her humanely, who had returned her precious photograph and followed international law, were also conducting bombing campaigns that might kill her family. How could both realities exist simultaneously? How could people be capable of such strict adherence to rules of prisoner treatment while also planning and executing mass destruction of civilian populations? Major Williams addressed this paradox directly during interrogation sessions in late March. "War is a terrible thing," she told Yuki through an interpreter. "But there are rules even in war. We follow the Geneva Convention because we believe prisoners deserve humane treatment regardless of what their government has done. We return your family photograph because it has no military value and great personal value. But we also prosecute the war with all available means because we believe our cause is just and victory is necessary." These things are not contradictory. They are both part of how civilized nations conduct warfare. This explanation satisfied no one, least of all Yuki, but it provided framework for understanding the apparent contradiction. Americans believed they could wage total war while maintaining certain standards of conduct. Whether this belief was justified or hypocritical remained a question without easy answers. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the prisoners followed news of the war's progression through carefully monitored radio broadcasts and censored newspapers. American forces had captured Iwo Jima in March and were currently fighting for Okinawa, battles that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Each American advance brought the war closer to Japan's home islands, closer to the inevitable invasion that would decide the conflict's outcome. The prisoners understood that their fate was tied to the war's conclusion. If Japan somehow achieved victory, they would likely be executed as traitors who had surrendered rather than fight to death. If America prevailed, they would eventually be repatriated to a defeated homeland where their families would bear the shame of their survival. There was no scenario in which their capture would not haunt them for the rest of their lives. Yet even knowing this, Yuki found herself grateful for the photograph she kept in her footlocker. Whatever happened, she would face it carrying proof that her family had existed, had loved her, had wished her well. That simple photograph, returned to her by enemy soldiers following international law, represented her last connection to a world before war destroyed everything. On August 6, 1945, the entire world changed. The news about Hiroshima reached the Presidio facility through military channels before it was publicly announced. Colonel Harrison called Major Williams to his office and shared the classified briefing he had received. A single atomic bomb, a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, had destroyed an entire city in an instant. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. A second bomb would be deployed if Japan did not surrender immediately. Harrison and Williams faced an ethical dilemma. Should they inform the prisoners about the atomic bombing? The information was technically classified, but rumors would inevitably spread through the facility. More importantly, several prisoners had family members living in or near Hiroshima. Withholding information about their potential deaths seemed unnecessarily cruel. After consultation with higher authorities, Harrison received permission to brief the prisoners about the atomic bomb. On August 8, Major Williams assembled all 18 women in the facility's briefing room for what would become one of the most difficult conversations of her military career. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning local time, the United States deployed a new type of weapon against the city of Hiroshima. Williams began, speaking slowly to allow the interpreter time to translate. This weapon, which we call an atomic bomb, releases energy through nuclear fission. Its destructive power exceeds any conventional weapon by orders of magnitude. A single bomb destroyed most of the city. Casualty estimates are not yet complete, but we believe tens of thousands of people were killed instantly. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and terrible. Several women began weeping immediately. Others sat frozen in shock, unable to process what they had heard. Petty Officer Kawasaki, whose aunt and uncle lived in Hiroshima, made a sound like an animal in pain and collapsed forward onto the table. Williams waited for the initial shock to pass before continuing. I am required to inform you that the United States possesses additional atomic weapons and will use them against other Japanese cities if your government does not surrender. I am also authorized to tell you that we strongly encourage surrender to prevent further loss of life. Yuki sat perfectly still, her mind racing. She had understood intellectually that America possessed superior industrial capacity. She had seen evidence of American organizational efficiency and technological sophistication, but this transcended everything she thought possible. A single bomb destroying an entire city was not merely superior technology, it was power that approached the divine. How many such weapons do you possess? Yuki heard herself asking. Williams chose her words carefully. That information is classified. I can tell you that we have the capacity to continue using them until Japan surrenders. The implication was clear. America could continue destroying Japanese cities one by one until nothing remained. Continued resistance was not merely futile, it was suicidal on a national scale. 3 days later, News of the second atomic bombing, this time against Nagasaki, reached the facility. The psychological toll on the prisoners was catastrophic. Women who had maintained emotional stability through 10 months of captivity suffered complete breakdowns. The facility's medical staff worked around the clock to prevent suicide attempts and provide psychiatric care. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers, announcing Japan's surrender. For the first time in recorded history, the emperor addressed his subjects directly, speaking words that effectively ended Japanese imperial ambitions. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he stated with characteristic understatement. The enemy has employed a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which is indeed incalculable. Yuki listened to that radio address while clutching her family photograph. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. Everything her military service had fought for, everything her brother might have died for, had ended in total defeat. The shame of her own survival was now compounded by the shame of national surrender. Yet even in that moment of absolute despair, she could not help but notice that she still possessed her photograph. The Americans, who had just demonstrated the power to destroy entire cities with single bombs, had nevertheless returned a powerless woman's family portrait because international law required it. This contradiction, this combination of overwhelming destructive capacity and scrupulous adherence to prisoner treatment protocols, defined the essential paradox of American power. Over the following months, as the facility prepared for prisoner repatriation, Major Williams conducted final psychological assessments of all 18 women. Her reports would later become foundational documents in understanding how propaganda shapes perception and how direct experience can, under certain conditions, overcome indoctrination. Subject Tanaka has undergone what I can only describe as complete cognitive restructuring, Williams wrote in her final assessment. She entered captivity believing Americans were subhuman savages who violated all standards of civilized conduct. Through 10 months of consistent, Geneva Convention-compliant treatment, she has developed a more nuanced understanding of American culture and military practice. The return of her family photograph, a seemingly minor detail, served as a constant reminder that her propaganda training had been fundamentally flawed. This single act, honoring international law by protecting personal possessions, did more to undermine Japanese propaganda than any interrogation technique or psychological pressure could have achieved. Williams' assessment of the broader implications was equally significant. These 18 women represent a unique intelligence asset. They possess intimate knowledge of how Japanese propaganda operates and how it fails when confronted with contrary evidence. More importantly, they can testify to the effectiveness of Geneva Convention compliance as both a moral imperative and a strategic advantage. By treating them humanely and protecting their personal possessions, we have created witnesses who will return to Japan with direct experience contradicting their government's characterization of American forces. The propaganda value of this testimony cannot be overstated. In March 1946, 18 months after their capture, Yuki and her companions boarded a repatriation ship bound for Japan. They carried with them the same canvas bags they had brought into captivity, containing the same personal possessions Americans had returned to them. Photographs, letters, journals, small treasures, objects that should have been lost or destroyed in the chaos of war but had been preserved through systematic adherence to international law. The Japan they returned to bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. American occupation forces controlled all major cities. The emperor, once considered divine, had publicly renounced his godhood. The military infrastructure that had dominated Japanese society for decades had been completely dismantled. The women found themselves returning to a homeland that was in some ways as foreign as their captivity had been. Yuki's family had survived, though their house had been damaged in a bombing raid on Yokohama's industrial district. Her brother had died fighting on Okinawa, one of more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed in that 3-month battle. Her parents, aged by war and grief, barely recognized her when she arrived at their damaged home. "We received notification that you had died honorably on Saipan," her father said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. "The neighbors believed you a hero. Now they know you surrendered." They know you are one of those who chose shame over death. Yuki had expected this reception. She had prepared herself for the stigma of survival. What she had not prepared for was her response to that stigma. Standing in her family's damaged home, she reached into her canvas bag and removed the photograph Americans had returned to her 10 months earlier. "I survived," she said simply, pressing the photograph into her father's hands. "I surrendered, and I lived. The Americans could have killed me. Their propaganda said they would. Our propaganda said they would. But they did not. They returned this to me. They followed rules and laws I had never been told existed. They treated me as a human being deserving of basic dignity. I am ashamed of many things, but I am no longer ashamed of learning the truth." Her father stared at the photograph, his own face looking back at him from a time before the world broke. In that moment, something shifted in his expression. Not acceptance, perhaps, but the beginning of understanding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.